weekly webinar with the Freedom Hub Working Group, and we do want to...
And today, by the way, it's February 27th, so it's that version of the event.
Thank you, Jeff, and we do want to thank our sponsors at Health Excellence Plus, changing the market from the creation of cash payers. And before I introduce our speakers, coming up, I do want to preview some other great speakers coming up. Next week, we're going to trash the Transportation Security Administration, TSA, with Becky Akers, who is a well-known critic of that agency and the hassles we experienced while traveling. What can we do? What can be done with air traffic security? And then the following week, we're going to have the famous libertarian Jacob Hornberger from the Future Freedom Foundation compare today's political structure with that of 100 years ago and how we can improve things. Then we have Chris Fryman, an up-and-coming libertarian philosopher. So he's going to talk about the failure of philosophers to improve society. And at the end of the month, the final Wednesday of March, we have the also famous Jeff Tucker from the Foundation of Economic Education talking about how if you want beauty and nice things, capitalism and free markets is the way to go. So that's a preview of upcoming guests. And today, Jeff, we have Joel Salatin from Polyface Farms, who's a famous figure for those who want to have freedom on the farms, with farmers having flexibility to grow whatever consumers want. And we all know consumers want better and better food, whether of the meat or the veggie variety. So he is the expert on that. Whether it's problems with the internal corruption of the Department of what he calls duh, or how do we get more craft foods. This is going to be an exciting webinar, I think. And commenting on his talk and building on that in the Farm to Consumer Legal Defense Fund is Pete Kennedy, who defends craft operations in the farm market. And they are always bludgeoned by the crony farms and industries. So he'll have some more thoughts on that. And finally, we have Ann Buteau from the Virginia Farm Freedom Organization, and she has been active politically to make some progress on the state level. And anyone else afterwards can ask questions. We'll have a good conversation, Jeff. So looking forward to it.
Fantastic. Well, on that note, Joel, the floor is yours.
Okay. Well, thank you, first of all, everybody, for broaching this topic, for bringing it on, and personally for letting me have this platform. It's an honor and a privilege, and I've certainly enjoyed the previous webinars that I've listened into the last few weeks, kind of getting a sense of this platform and preparing for it. One of the beauties of this topic is that it is extremely bipartisan. We embrace, everybody eats. And so it's probably food and food issues are probably the biggest tent out there that we can imagine. You can do without a lot of things, but food is not one of them. And what we've got right now in the country is an effort to bring food into the bureaucratic place so that the only food that's available for people is licensed and complies with all sorts of regulations that the government has. These regulations are very size prejudicial. I think that's one of the critical elements. They're very size prejudicial. In other words, it's much harder to comply if you're small than to comply when you're large. And so I think the overriding question is, how do we get safer, higher quality food in the marketplace? Do we get it from a top-down, licensing bureaucratic approach? Do we need another agency, more what we call regulatory oversight of the food system in order to get safer, higher quality food? And furthermore, how do we give more choice, more choice options in the marketplace? And when we start asking those questions, it leads us quickly to the fact that there are many things that people would like to buy that aren't available down at the supermarket. There's not much local about the supermarket, but you look at the shelves. Where is the homemade charcuterie? Where is the raw milk? Where is the the cottage scale chicken? It's not there. And the reason is because we have a plethora of regulations that keep food, value-added food, and farmers from being able to access the marketplace. Now, lest anybody thinks that these regulations are primarily about safety, and I'm not a conspiratist. I don't think there's a bunch of mean-spirited bureaucrats out there. I really do believe that they don't trust farmers. They don't trust business in general, and they certainly don't trust farmers. And when I start talking about food freedom, the first blowback from most people is, well, people would die because all this bad food that would enter the marketplace, and as if no bad food is already entering the marketplace. So I think that the question is about efficacy and the efficacy of actual safe food and innovative food. And we don't need to read the news very much about recalls and nutrient deficiency in food and the fact that quality has gone down. Okay, so answers. There is a very active food entrepreneurial sector in the agriculture sector. It's very small. It sometimes goes by the moniker of local food, integrity food, farm to table, farm to fork. There's all sorts of ways to describe it. This is not about organic or anything else. It's about direct producer to consumer market access. The idea that if I want to go to your farm, smell around, ask around, look around, and exercise voluntary choice as a consenting adult, we should be able to transact business. I should be able to get a glass of milk. I should be able to get a pickle from your pantry. I should be able to ask you to make me a quiche or some heavy soup, and we should be able to transact business, and without a bureaucrat being involved. There are numerous efforts in this. Probably in the state of Maine, we have the tip of the iceberg in the pushback on the regulatory infrastructure, and that was the food sovereignty law in Sedgwick, Maine, which was put forth several years ago. It grew to several other townships. Maine pushed back. Basically, the food sovereignty law was about a 2/3 of a page ordinance that said, in our locality, our township, consenting adults can interact in food commerce without a bureaucrat being involved, as long as it's a voluntary transaction. And what happened was Maine pushed back until finally there were too many townships. Maine then, the governor, they signed the law into effect so that a township could legally do this without the state coming in on them. The next day, the USDA, I call it the USDA, responded and said they would pull all of Maine's federal inspection if Maine went through with that law. And Maine then buckled, and basically it gutted the whole food sovereignty law proposals. There are cottage food laws, and Pete Kennedy will be able to speak to those more specifically, but several states have those. But the battle is in its infancy. Several years ago, I know Ann Buteau is on the call here. She's the president of the Virginia Independent Consumers and Farmers Association, which a group of us started a decade ago or more to try to do something at the state level. And if it hadn't been for us today, it would be illegal to drink milk from your own cow in the state of Virginia. But we were able to stop that. On a positive note, we did get a pickle bill. So you can now do $3,000 worth of pickles in your home and sell them to end users without a license. I don't know what it is about the $3,001 pickle that suddenly moves it from a great thing to a hazardous substance, but that's the way these things are. Kentucky right now has an ordinance put forth that will make it illegal to be able to drink milk from a cow that you own a share in. It's targeted against cow share or herd share exemptions on milk. I think that the important thing here to understand is that all over this country, there are tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of consumers desperate to opt out of supermarket fare. They want it available and they want it affordable. And there are thousands and thousands of farmers and beginning farmers desperate to connect with these folks, especially with more value-added product, more convenience-oriented product, where it's not just commodity. Neither of those two groups can get together in the marketplace due to this regulatory environment. I'll conclude with just one story that happened that we lived through here just 2 years ago. So we had a Culinary Institute of America graduate here at the farm as an intern, and she wanted to come back and launch a meat pie business. And so she started, jumping through the hoops. And we have customers who would love to be able to buy meat pies from us, and we would love to sell them to them. So she started through the regulatory hoops. We have a nice big commercial kitchen here on the farm. It's not licensed, but so we called the health department out to look at it. They said, oh, it's a beautiful kitchen. Everything's wonderful. But where's your bathroom? And I said, well, we have a bathroom in our house, which is 100 yards away. We have two, in fact. We have two in Mom's house, which is 100 yards away. Two in Daniel's house, that's our son and his wife, 100 yards away. So we have 6 bathrooms basically within 100 yards. Why do we need a bathroom? He said, well, it's just that's the law. If you're gonna have a licensed kitchen, you have to have a bathroom. I said, well, can we put a porta potty up here? No, it has to be porcelain. I said, can it be composting? No, it can't be. It has to be porcelain, water, septic, blah blah blah, the whole deal. So we're talking about a leach field and a $20,000 deal. So I asked him. I said, now wait a minute. I said, what if we had a food truck? He said, oh, well, if you had a food truck, none of that's required. I said, wait a minute, you mean if we took this kitchen and put it on a chassis, we could do this without any bathroom whatsoever? He said, yes, and that's a loophole we're trying to close up. So watch for bathrooms on the back of food trucks. The point that I'm getting at is that here we had a young aspiring entrepreneur ready to launch a really clean meat pie business. We wanted the market, our customers wanted to buy, and in between was this bureaucrat and this labyrinth of requirements that precluded the business from being launched. So what happens is, in the real world, innovation requires embryonic prototypes to launch, and these regulations require much larger facilities in order to pay for the overhead of the compliance. And as a result, many of these embryonic prototypes that are antidotes to the recalls, the Campylobacter, E. coli, Listeria, and all the things that we see in the chlorine and in the food system, the antidotes for that cannot be launched at a scale that's small enough to birth the baby. And so what we have are dreams and fantasies and aspirations on both sides, both the buyer and seller, that result from stillbirths of entrepreneurial ideas and antidotes to the current system that we have. And so what I would like, I don't know what all the answer is. I mean, there's everything from simply don't ask, don't tell. There's certainly a huge black market for things going on. I think Pete Kennedy told me we had 200,000 people drinking raw milk in Virginia now. Much of that is underground, or it's on the quiet. I would like to see actually a food emancipation proclamation that would unshackle the food system from these onerous, discriminatory, prejudicial, scale-dependent regulations. There are different things. There are personal, what are they called? Personal or private association membership, PAMs, private association memberships like private country clubs that are developing, that are trying to circumvent this. People selling pet food. There's a food church in North Carolina that a lady named Niti Bali has created. So you have to join her food church, and then you get to engage in all the joys of being able to engage in food commerce. So that there are numerous pushbacks on this. But again, I really welcome the platform here to be able to express what you don't see on the front page of the newspapers, and that is this latent. It's like a coiled spring of both buyer and seller wanting to participate, but a bureaucrat gets in the way of their participation.
Joel, this is Jeff Cantor here. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, sure can.
It's very interesting before we hear from Pete in the end, because I'm excited to hear what they have to kind of interface on what you've said. But, the reality is every week we have this call and it's about a different topic, but the problem and the solution are invariably the same. And so was everyone's decrying the national emergency the president's declared, and it, kind of dismisses Congress. It's all dismissed based on what you're describing, and every week exposes the fact that it's invariably this regulatory state that is really our bigger problem than all. And in fact, what you're describing, and many other weeks similarly, it's just about the grassroots really just taking control and becoming that death of 1,000 paper cuts, because to forever lobby or legislate or wait for someone to get in there, it's an effort and futility. So it's just the diffusion of what you're describing across the country that's happening is really how we bring that whole house of cards down. One thing that came to mind as you were describing the urgency for people to get something local, and I know I'm in Cleveland, Ohio, so there are a couple grocery stores that have basically some produce that they feature as local, but the rest of the store is completely commercial. That needs to become that Uberization. I want to get, Grubhub type thing, so I want food delivered to my house. I've got these farms tied into an app where I can almost fill all of my food needs from my local resources, and that becomes a way from the bottom up to battle back, because that's the only way we're going to win it, is the bottom up, because whatever you pass as a legal solution, I still need all that consumer buy-in. So why am I wasting time, us similarly from what we are on this call, working also from the top down? We need to be more concentrated on working from the bottom up and collapsing everything accordingly. So I just see that as a thematic feel from every call we have this week. I don't know what your take on it is, because you're really living and breathing it in a very up-close way.
Well, yes, you're exactly right, which is one reason why I have kind of been reluctant to put a lot of effort into launching something like a food emancipation proclamation and trying to get that, because that is a hard nut to crack. And so most of my effort is about circumvention and non-compliance, so that we empower people to just essentially participate in guerrilla marketing and guerrilla stuff. But most people don't have the savvy to do that. They didn't grow up on the debate team like I did, and they want to be legal. They don't want to look over their shoulders every day. And so every place that we can carve out a little niche of freedom, we just see farmers and consumers rush into that spot. And yes, I'm all about the Uberization of the food system, and I think this is one of those elements where the Uberization is there. By what a stroke of tyranny can anybody say with clear conscience that they have the right to determine what I should feed my 3 trillion member internal microbiome? I mean, that is as sacred a right as speaking and assembly. If I can't decide what fuel to feed my body to go, shoot, pray, or preach, what good are those freedoms if I can't pick my own fuel?
Well, the luxury, of course, what you're describing is the universal appeal, because the premise of webinar is twofold. One, to allow everyone else to learn what's afoot, because everyone doesn't really realize none of this stuff is in the news, what's going on everywhere, and how we can help rise each other's tide, because collectively it's all about individual freedom, each with a different facet. But yours is almost at the most cutting edge in that it's the core, because every single person has to eat. So it cuts across every boundary from race, creed, this, that, whatever you want to throw out as a label. This is it. And so the idea that, you know, if I can get local produce and all the rest of that stuff, that would flourish an amazing economy than to just continually, you know, we're trying to break down some of the stuff we've discussed, medical world and getting back to independent doctors and whatever. How do we get back to independent food? And so that's a very elusive situation, because literally everything is so commercialized. And being in a health-oriented mentality, how do you get to a better diet when the whole system is predicated on the worst food possible that you can eat? And there's no encouragement for any innovation whatsoever other than to create a different version of Fruit Loops this week type of a thing. So, I mean, it's amazing, you know, and no one kind of and that's what we try to do on this webinars, is just have far enough away to see that 50,000-foot view, because everybody's up too close, and that becomes the problem. You know, you got to see that overarching thing, and you've been living it, which is just amazing. I mean, and look at all these years you've labored in kind of silence out there. I mean, now suddenly it's your 10-year overnight sensation. So it's pretty interesting to see. But let's continue, because we're running on limited time. So let's get Pete to start to get in here a little bit and add his perspective.
All right, thanks, Jeff.
This is Pete Kennedy. And Pete, before you start, give a 2-second explanation as to who you are.
I'm an attorney, worked for a couple organizations. I worked for the Farm to Consumer Legal Defense Fund. I was president of that organization for about 7.5 years. And I also worked for Weston Price. I mean, I've started doing basically project work for them about 16 years ago. And basically the relationship between the two is Weston Price is a chapter leader system. It's the job of the chapter leaders to find nutritious food from farmers like Joel. And it's the job of the Farm to Consumer Legal Defense Fund to protect that access to nutritious food. So basically, the Legal Defense Fund started in 2007. That was the year Joel came out with a book called Everything I Want to Do Is Illegal, which tracks the experience of the Legal Defense Fund more than any other book that I know of. Joel talked about the different problems he had with various bureaucracies at the local, state, and federal level. And if you're at the local level, you might get into a dispute with the local health department, local zoning. At the state level, could be the State Department of Agriculture, State Department of Health, Department of Labor, Department of Environmental Protection. And at the federal level, could be FDA, USDA, or Department of Environmental Protection, or maybe even the Federal Trade Commission. So you're looking at just a number of different bureaucracies that can get in your way. Where the Legal Defense Fund has seen the most progress is at the state level. At the local level, you get a lot of these not in my backyard attitudes. I mean, Joel brought up Maine. That's one state where they are making tremendous progress at the local level through these town adoption of what's called the local food sovereignty ordinance. At the federal level, mainly the Legal Defense Fund's work has been to just stop bad legislation affecting small farmers, artisan producers. But there are a couple pieces of legislation they've worked on. One of them is the Prime Act. One of the worst federal laws ever passed was the Wholesome Meat Act of 1967, which just gave USDA jurisdiction over intrastate commerce. At the time it was passed, there were a number of these custom slaughter facilities where you could go to that facility, get your meat processed without an inspector being present, and your animal processed and sell to direct to consumers. The Wholesome Meat Act changed that. Now, if you go to a custom facility where there's no inspector at a custom facility to watch slaughter take place, you have to distribute that meat only to owners of the animal. People who are owners of the animal at time of slaughter, your own family or non-paying guests. What the Prime Act would do would be to basically restore the law in that area to the way it was over 50 years ago, where if you had took an animal to a custom slaughterhouse, you could sell the meat from that animal within the state you raised and the animal had it slaughtered. Right now, you have an inspection system where there's federally inspected slaughterhouses and processing plants. There are state inspected slaughterhouses and processing plants, and only about half the states have their own inspection program. So there's a real shortage of access for these farmers raising meat animals. The problem there isn't the lack of demand. There's plenty of demand for that, just for the demand for grass-fed beef has grown tremendously. The problem is for a lot of these people finding a slaughterhouse. There's one state in particular, New York. I've talked to people there who have said they have to make a reservation a year in advance to take their animal in for slaughter. I've even heard someone say who was intent on contacting the closest inspected slaughterhouse to get the animal slaughtered, that it took 2 years. I had to make a reservation 2 years out. So the Prime Act would give, and that stands for Processing Revival and Intrastate Meat Exemption Act, would give states the right to pass laws allowing the sale of meat processed at a slaughtered and processed at a custom facility direct to consumers, or depending on the state law, it could be to restaurants, grocery stores, hotels, other institutions. So it's a piece of legislation that's empowering the states, putting some more teeth back in the 10th Amendment. And it's been introduced the last two sessions. Tom Massey, representative from Kentucky's 4th District, has introduced it. He's a cattle farmer himself. He says he's up the hill like 3 or 4 miles from a custom house. And if this bill passes, all he has to do is put his truck in neutral, just roll down the hill to the custom house, and he can sell to whoever he wants. Right now, I don't know how long he's away from a federally inspected facility, because I don't think Kentucky has their own state inspection program, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was 2 or 3 hours. So that is probably the piece of federal legislation we've worked on more than any other that has gotten support. It's gotten between 20 and 25 sponsors the last two sessions. There's the meat packers haven't really opposed it yet. I think they're waiting to see it get more traction. Then they'll probably step in and oppose it. But it's just would really open things up and increase the market share of what Joel was mentioning, was calling the local food system. I mean, Joel was gracious enough to hold a fundraiser each year for the Legal Defense Fund. I think it was for 8 years or so. And I just remember at one of those fundraisers, he just mentioned that he thought 2% of the food dollar right now goes to local food. And I think the truth is there'd be a lot more going to local food right now, instead of but it's the regulatory system that prevents more of the food dollar going to local food. Just a couple other things we've worked at, the Legal Defense Fund has worked at the federal level. I think, as most of you know, there's an interstate ban on raw milk for human consumption crossing state lines. Any raw dairy product except aged raw cheese. Again, Representative Massey has introduced two pieces of legislation. One that would make it legal to ship raw milk and raw milk products in interstate commerce from a state where it is legal to any other state. And then a second bill that was would make it legal to ship raw milk products from one state where it's legal to another state where it's legal. That's more of a modified bill. And that bill actually was a vote. There was a vote before in the House of Representatives to get that bill included in the Farm Bill. And it was pretty bad. I think it was like 331 to 79 against, but looking at the positive side, that's 79 potential sponsors for the next time Representative Massey introduces a raw milk bill. There's the main work the Legal Defense Fund has done policy-wise has been at the state level. And just a couple of things I'll say about the Legal Defense Fund real quick is that, you know, thanks to the support of people like Joel, just the Weston Price Foundation, it's, you know, it's really in an expansion process now. They're trying to get local counsel in every state to help if there's some kind of emergency that comes up with a member. I mean, in this way and other ways, the Legal Defense Fund is patterned after the Homeschool Legal Defense Association. And I know their president, Michael Ferris, has said that it took many years to get just an attorney in every state. So that's kind of the growing pains you have to go through to reach that level. But then also their Legal Defense Fund will be ramping up the resources they put into policy, working on state legislation. And that's the where you see most of the progress being made these days. There are 4 states, to one degree or another, that have passed legislation just allowing the unregulated sale direct of farmer to consumer, from farmer and artisan producer to consumer. The only thing the states can't allow unregulated direct sales for are meat sales, and that's because of the Federal Meat Inspection Act, and poultry up to a limited level. But if you go above a certain level at poultry, the Poultry Products Inspection Act, Federal Act takes over, and you can only sell so many poultry a year without regulation. But to the people who say you get worried about this being a food safety risk, I mean, there's now a track record. There've been, Maine first started these food sovereignty ordinances about 8 years ago now. There are about 40 to 50 towns. And, you know, originally, I think the first year there were maybe 10, 11 towns or so. As far as I know, there's never been a report of any illness attributed to a producer operating under, you know, a town food sovereignty ordinance. Wyoming passed a Food Sovereignty Act 4 years ago, which is the broadest of the Food Sovereignty or Food Freedom Acts. It allows the sale of everything, just about any food you can think of, except meat, unregulated for a producer to consumer, including any raw milk product. Those again, if there are any reports on any illnesses attributed to a producer operating under the Wyoming Food Freedom Act, I haven't heard about it. Utah and North Dakota have passed more limited laws, but still a good bit of food can be sold unregulated, direct for a producer to consumer. Again, I haven't heard of a single instance, single illness blamed on anyone operating under those laws. I mean, Utah's law is about a year old. North Dakota's law is about 2 years old. And to me, from what I've seen, they're really building incentives where you can sell food, building incentives on quality and safety on local sales from producer direct to consumer. First incentive is that the producer, just about all the time is feeding that same food to his own family. Second incentive is some of these big corporations have, a budget set aside for damages if there are any illnesses. It's a cost of doing a business. With a local food producer, that's usually not true. I mean, one possibly as little as one illness can put that producer out of business if there's a lawsuit. Same thing if the agency suspected the food the producer was making was adulterated, they could shut down, seize the food, get a seizure order, embargo the food, prevent the producer from moving it. And that alone can put someone out of business. I basically, Legal Defense Fund worked with a couple cheesemakers, unfortunately, because of these seizure type orders that just put them out. So there's plenty of, well, I guess the other thing I'd say too is while this is going on, the industrial food system is having more and more problems with food safety. I mean, we've all heard about the illnesses attributed to consumption of romaine lettuce in the past year. And last summer, I went to an international food safety conference, and there was an official from FDA who was speaking, and he said to this audience that the packing plant, this was the first romaine lettuce outbreak where a couple hundred people were sick. I think 5 people died. He was saying that that packing plant that packaged the lettuce was under the Food Safety Modernization Act, which is supposedly this law that's going to all give us safe food. So the safest food really is produced at the local level, and that I think is true whether the producer is regulated or unregulated. And like Joel says, you get these laws which just set the bar so high as far as economies of scale that the local producer can't apply. They act as basically a de facto ban if you have a local producer who wants to do things by the book, do things right by the law. I mean, there was just a great example of that in Montana a couple of days ago. There's raw milk is one of those states where distribution is very limited in Montana, at least legal distribution. So this representative, who's basically carrying the ball for the dairy industry, introduced this bill. I mean, the dairy industry is worried there about the competition raw milk would pose, even though it's 2 different products. I don't agree that there's all that much competition between the 2. But this bill would have limited, it had 2 tiers of licensing and regulation. They were called small scale producers and large scale producer. Anyone above 10 gallons a day was a small scale producer, and was no longer a small scale producer. He was a commercial producer. That was the term they used. And so you could have 2 or 3 cows under that bill, and be a commercial producer. And if you were a commercial producer, you had to have a facility that was in compliance with the standards for grade A dairies under the pasteurized milk ordinance. And, there's basically the figure I've gotten when I asked people about how much it would cost to be a grade A dairy, be under the pasteurized milk ordinance, is $200,000. So how is someone with 2 or 3 cows going to scale up? So fortunately, that bill was defeated, but that's the way you get rid of competition. You can't have a monopoly without the government, and so you move in, just get these laws passed that set the bar high enough where the big industry will be able to comply with them, but the small producer will not. just in, yeah.
I was just going to say, unfortunately, in terms of what you're describing here, and from us doing this call every week, as it were, it's like, oh, great, now here's another thing I have to get involved in. Because it's almost a life or death situation or a save the republic or not situation, invariably with every single person we have on the call every week. And it's the truth, because we're being under assault from so many fronts. And keeping an eye on our time, I want to kind of add a last little twist here, and then we want to be able to squeeze some questions in. So we've got Ann Buteau today, and she's from the Virginia Independent Consumer Farmers Association, and I'm going to let her have a little 2 cents in here for a minute too. Are you there? Ann, are you able to chime in? I hear that you're there.
And Jeff, this is Charlie. Well, and I guess to her mic, I have a question for Joel. In one of your articles, you criticized the Department of Duh is organic label, and you also wrote somewhere else that if you want to get rid of abusive practices with factory farms, again, get rid of the Department of Duh. As someone who wants really healthy local food, tell us about that Department of Duh and how it can't give you the clean organic food that they claim with their own labeling system, and it's them that give you factory farming. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, let's just go into some slaughtering requirements, whether it's sterilization with chlorine, washing eggs with chlorine. There are numerous things like this that they that they require. Pete mentioned the scale and size of the grade A dairy compliant situation. So the thing to remember is that food that you see available in the supermarket has all gone through a plethora of licensing compliance requirements that are largely requirements of infrastructure or paperwork. They're not actually testing food. They're not actually testing it to see if it's got pathogens in it very much. And so what happens is, let's say there's a test for chickens, and the test costs $300. Well, that's a spit in the ocean for a Tyson that's doing 100,000 chickens a day in a plant. But for a small plant that's doing 500 a day, that $300 test is your entire day's profits. That's what I'm talking about regarding scale discrimination within the system. So when somebody asks, well, give me an example of a regulation that's not scale discriminatory. Okay, here's one. Speed limits. It doesn't take any more effort to push the brake on an 18-wheeler as it does a Prius. That's a completely scale independent regulation. It's a speed limit. Anytime you have a regulation that's easier to comply with when you're big, that is one that stymies innovation and embryonic entrepreneurship into the system.
And did you able to get back online? It looked like you did. All right, well, if that's the case, I've got everybody basically unmuted, so we're going to open up for questions, and if Ann can join us, we will. Just as a because we did not want to exclude her, just as a brief, this is the website. We'll send this in our post email and post on the LinkedIn site. But this is what they're doing. Joel, do you know anything about this organization, or either of the two of you? Just to kind of cover for a minute.
Yeah, I was one of the founders of VICFA and served as president for numerous years as it kind of got on its feet, and now it's still moving right along, but it's small, but it's very powerful. It's and what VICFA is very much, you see there, the direct unregulated sales between neighbors, and so that's what we're after. We're not talking about unregulated food to Thailand or export or the supermarket. We're saying among consenting adults, you should be able to exercise freedom of choice. And notice I'm using very, very significant words here. We've become the culture of tolerance. Everybody's about tolerance. Well, where's the tolerance for me if I want to get a jar of pickles or a pepperoni from a neighbor? And so the Virginia Independent Consumers and Farmers Association lobbies. I mean, we are a lobby organization to protect farmers from coercive things coming from the state, and then at the same time to try to create additional freedoms. And right now, we're a couple of years ago we got a pickle bill for $3,000 worth of pickles a year, unregulated, and a year before that we got a baking. So if it's you can now bake bread in your home. If it's a non-hazardous thing, you can bake bread in your home and sell it to a neighbor. The big inconsistency in this thing is that all this stuff that we're talking about that requires a license is perfectly fine to give away. You can give it away. You can give you can give a quart of canned beef stew to your neighbor when they come back from the hospital, and that's being a great American and doing a wonderful benevolent thing. But if that neighbor says, when they get well and they go back to work and they say, wow, that was great stew, would you make some of that? I'd buy it from you every week if you'd make some. As soon as you get a dime for it, now it's suddenly a hazardous substance, and you're a criminal if you sell it to them. So what is it about exchanging a dollar that turns it from a benevolent, wonderful thing to a hazardous substance? That's one of the many questions surrounding this thing. And Pete, Farm and Consumer Legal Defense Fund, I can give you a story there quickly. We got a call one day from one of our chefs. We supply about 50 restaurants. He called in a panic. He said the health department was just here and threw out your eggs. He said they were illegal. I said, what's the, and so he gave me the name of the inspector and the citation. And I just called Pete Kennedy. I said, here's what happened. And do you know, within 24 hours, we had an apology from the health department that they had overstepped, that we were right, they were wrong, and it wouldn't happen again. Now, how long do you think that would have taken me as a dumb farmer to get that sort of concession from the health department? So that's the kind of clout that Farm to Consumer Legal Defense Fund offers. That if I have a problem, I get 24/7, 365 real-time legal counsel, and now I have an attorney talking to their attorney. It's like talking to light. It's the general talking to the general, and suddenly I have status in the system. That I can't overstate the power and the strength of that.
That holds true in every organization that we discuss every week, is the idea of interconnecting with the tools, because there's so many people slugging it out on their own, independent, and they really don't understand there's a lot to cocoon them. So it's great to be able to show there is a support system. We just need to get more organized. Let's take some time. We've got a few minutes left. So are there any questions we've got for any of our panelists? We lost Dan. I see she lost her connection somehow, so I'm glad you kind of explained a little bit about them. But does anybody else out there in the general audience have a question they might want to throw out there? Everyone's unmuted, so just unmute yourself. You've wowed everybody into total submission. They just can't believe they're not allowed to eat.
Jeff, I'll ask a question. This is Charlie.
Yeah, go.
Joel, if you're going to call the Ag Department the Department of Duh, have you ever said that it should be abolished, which would be a good thing?
Well, yes, I have. I don't think there's any federal government department that has been so successful at annihilating its constituency. What they ought to do is tie the number of employees of the U.S. to the number of farmers there are. But anyway, that's beside it. Yeah, I've made no mistake that I think that it's unnecessary. But again, you say those kinds of things and you're kind of a nutcase. So I'd rather stay down here in the trenches where people really are, and somebody's trying to get a quiche, somebody's trying to get a meat pie somebody's trying to get a glass of raw milk. Let's figure out how to make that happen.
A real quick follow-up. General libertarian theory suggests that there should be able to arise in a market free market rating agencies to replace the bureaucracy. Is there any kind of certification process on a voluntary basis out there in the market that consumers can use to find out that Joel Salatin is certified this way or has this kind of private inspection? What is the market replacement of the ag department that's out there?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are certainly lots of certifications, in production, animal welfare, fair trade, of course, organic certification. That's government, but there's now, beyond organic certification, which is private. There's eco certified. I mean, there are, I don't know what, 15 to 20 private certifications. All of them, though, regard production practices. They're all about production. They're not about processing, or they're not about processing. And so what we're seeing here is that as the consumer moves away from their kitchens and they want more value-added product, we joke around here, what our customers really want is Polyface Hot Pockets. And so as the millennial generation moves into the marketing sector wanting convenience, we farmers, we realize that if we just stay in the commodity business selling through conventional commodity channels and let the middlemen take all the markups, we have to produce tons and tons and pounds in order to get enough money to make a buck. But if we can wear those middleman hats, if we can make the cheese, if we can make the stew, if we can make the meat pie, if we can make the cake, then we can be, as small farmers, we can still have a full-time income even as a small farmer, because we're getting those value-added additional markup hats. That's what this is about, and there is no certification privately that I know of in this whole process sector.
Interesting place we find ourselves. Well, unfortunately, and boy, I'll tell you, this could go for another hour at the very least. We're out of time here already today. So thanks everybody. We're going to post this. We're going to definitely could reconvene on this again because it's such an important topic. And real quick to close it out, Charles, who have we got coming up for us next week?
I will do that, but I think, Pete, do you want to have a final minute as well?
Yeah, I'm still on. There's one other project that the Legal Defense Fund has going on, and that's an interstate, a petition before FDA to just lift the interstate ban on raw butter. I mean, the unusual thing is when you look at the CDC records, there are no cases of illness caused by the consumption of raw butter. And when you get all these raw dairy foods that are legal to consume, but somehow they're not legal to obtain, I mean, it's just a good, it's a good example of how the laws need to be reformed. And just last thing I'll say real quick about Joel's organization, VICFA. VICFA is one of the best organizations I've seen at just taking their own initiative, not waiting for the legislature to do anything, and just basically exercising their own constitutional rights as far as distribution of food among private parties go. So they're a model for a lot of other states.
Well, that's great. The sponsor of this program, everyone, Health Excellence Plus, is trying to, fix the health market with very choosy cash-paying consumers, and anyone in health knows that. Also in medicine, food is medicine. So this has been a great webinar for us in that field, and we want to broach this topic again down the road. Next week, however, we're going to have Becky Akers, a big critic of the TSA, and let's everyone come back for that one, because we shouldn't be sheep tolerating the mistreatment and unneeded excessive security theater at our airports when there's obviously better alternatives out there. And then we'll have Jacob Hornberger in 2 weeks talk about some of the bigger picture ideas about our structure of government and society. So thanks very much, Joel and Pete and Jeff.
Thank you.
Yeah, really,
Thank you.
yeah, that really was very good. And so we'll certainly want to readdress this for sure, because it's such an important topic. And it's going to be keen to see how much all those things we've mentioned that really do need to exist, the Uberization to help all you guys happen, who's going to step up and create the app for that. So let's watch that be born. So thanks again. We'll meet each other next week. And thanks again for joining us today.